We had the schedule adjustment a little earlier, and I think what we will do now, if everybody agrees, is we'll have about half an hour of an open discussion, and then we'll have the break, and then after the break, we'll go to Jackie's session that we skipped, just so we don't lose the flow of what was going on here. So I will now open the floor for anybody who would like to comment on our three excellent opening set of remarks. We'll try, if you can just keep your remarks, succinct as usual, we can hear from as many people as possible. So I will, yeah.
Thank you. I think that we need to put another problem to have a more equilibrated conclusion about the problem of refugees or migrations. I read just this morning, Africa subsides the rest of the world by over 40 billion in 1 year, according to new research. That is to say, these people to come to the more rich countries maybe come because the rich countries take to these people the possibility also to develop. The President Prodi say, we don't have a policy to Africa. Yes, we have a policy that is to take all that we can take. This is the policy. And we need to put also this question. Non-common policy. Well, I think it's common policy, not recognized as common policy. Anyway, I put this question because really it's a problem. The same for the Syria, the same for Asia, the same for the other countries. Thank you.
Yes, Virgilio.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Virgilio Viana from Brazil. I'd just like to pick on Jeff's point about migration being a result of a failure of sustainable development. I think that's a very simple way of describing it, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I'd just like to highlight the importance of environmental factors driving migration. And this is not only a result of climate change catastrophes, but it's a result of degradation of ecosystems. And just take the very simple examples of fisheries, where we have about 70% of global fisheries overfished and under extinction. So a lot of communities that depend on fisheries are migrating because of that. Take the case of desertification in places like Africa and in other places of the world, like in the northeast of Brazil, where people are being displaced because of degradation of natural ecosystems. And I'd just like to share with you the concept of sustainable involvement, which is something I wrote many years ago, and now it's gaining more traction again. In Portuguese, desenvolvimento means lack of involvement. So when people are moved away from their homelands, that in a way is desenvolvimento. So what we need is to have envolvimento sustentável, sustainable involvement. It's to engage people locally and look at the root causes of migration. And in our cases, environmental issues are very, very important. And if we want to deal with those issues, we should invest in restoration of degraded ecosystems. So the point that I'd just like to highlight is the importance of giving an emphasis on environmental drivers and looking at ways that we can promote sustainable involvement through restoration and through valuation of ecosystem services, which are very important in terms of securing resilience in light of climate change factors that we're now facing.
Thank you, Virgilio. I'll turn now to Metropolitan Emmanuel.
Thank you, Chairman. Your Eminence, dear friends. I think there is a need to clarify who is immigrant and who is a refugee. And we need to do that from the very beginning in order to continue, because this is very much needed indeed. And then, of course, immigration is not a new phenomenon. I would like, being a Greek of origin, to mention how much in the ancient Greek world we had the metropolis and the colonies. Nothing to do with the colonialism that we had later and all the negative impact of colonialism. At that time, the relations between the metropolis and the colonies, which were, of course, all the immigrants who were there, but they wanted to leave, and they had all the colonies. We know very well what happened especially in what we call the Magna Grecia in Italy, how many colonies were there, the good relations that existed. We cannot say that today we have very good relations with different countries where the migrants go, and the countries of origin. And then we spoke about the agreements. Flying yesterday into Rome, we all probably heard that the Schengen Agreement, because of the G7, does not exist. So you have to go through passport controls. So who decides, where is the agreements that we have with entering into one country? Then the question, I think, is also needed to reflect on the in the biblical history we have several references. We have the Jews being in Egypt. We have the deportation of the Jews in Babylon. How do you call the deportation? Were they immigrants? Were they refugees? What happened with the Jewish population in general that for 2,000 years they had no country? What were they called? And then all the Americans of today, I don't think that we need to see also are they sons and daughters of immigrants until today? And of course in other countries, but I think also that we need to look into these questions, and then also the environmental aspect needs to be more deeply examined, because we need to see what is the impact of all the disasters on the environment that we cause, and then we have as an effect, all these question of migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Klaus, Owen, and then Vittorio. Yeah, and then Cardinal John.
Thank you, Tony. I think it's great that we mentioned that dealing with the symptoms only doesn't really help us if we don't look for the roots. And one of the points with regard to looking for the roots, I wanted to go on record with the word of good governance. We have a massive governance issue here, and not only in the south, but also in the north. And if you look that there are migrants, that there are refugees from Burundi going into Rwanda, because the political situation and stability there is so much better than at home, or from Zimbabwe to South Africa, these are issues that we also have to take into consideration. On the other hand, we have double standards in the north. We look at, we do not treat the same issue the same way. We leave the Greeks alone with the burden they have. We leave the Italians alone with the burdens they have. We don't mind about the Hungarians building up new fences. And you know, this is hypocrisy, to say the least. And the last point, in this introduction of the Agenda 2030, we mentioned that all stakeholders must help to find a solution. And that reminds me of a situation that in fall 2015, the Atalanta mission, where the NATO was kind of sending warships to rescue migrants drowning in the Mediterranean, had to be cancelled because the $80 million were not available from the European countries. At the same time, the Diocese of Cologne published its financial report and showed that they have 3.5 billion in cash and shares. You know, what if Cardinal Meissner would have said, we pay for Atalanta for the next 3 years and hope that the international community picks it up then? You cannot accuse others if you are not on record that you do what is within your own means.
Owen?
Thank you. Those were incredibly rich opening remarks this morning, and I just want to comment on something that really struck me as profound and deep, which was the way in which all the speakers brought out the importance of the concept of home. And I think this is something that, again, it just struck me as very powerful. So, and it relates to what Jeffrey called this moral conundrum. So it seemed to me that were we to think, often we think about the sort of proximate problem of refugees and so on as a problem for the host country, as it were, to decide about whether and how we are going to accept people at our borders. And as Jeffrey brought out, there is this conflict, and it's not clear how to get over it, that insofar as our home antecedently is a place in which we have certain, it's the place that makes possible our civic friendships. It's the place that makes possible certain kind of identity we have, perhaps as a people. It's the place that gives us the place in which our love and work are possible, as our first speaker said. But I think thinking about the other side gets us to think more deeply about why it is so horrifying that people are displaced, because they lose the location in which they can have civic friendships, the place in which their love and work is possible, the spaces in which their identity and the conditions of carrying on their identity as a people are lost. And I think this is an invitation, at least for me, to think more deeply about what Romano Prodi just talked about at the end. One way to think about things is to worry about how, in fact, we will make the homes of people who are being driven out of their homes more hospitable to them by doing things in advance to make their homes more peaceful, more economically feasible, less unequal, such that they want to leave their home. Because it just strikes me, this is, we started with Aristotle, and again, Aristotle says, one of the many things he says that are wise, is no one would ever choose, I don't know what happiness or flourishing is, but he says this, no one would ever choose to live without friends. And I think that thinking of displacement as a way of undermining civic friendships and identity creates a different kind of responsibility, a responsibility to work antecedently to make the homes of various peoples on earth more conducive to their flourishing and fulfillment. So I appreciate opening up this line of inquiry to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Owen. Vittorio?
Well, it is not easy to add something after the very impressive presentations and the very somber outlook that the most experienced politician, Romano Prodi, has given us about the future. And I do think that what Metropolitan Adamakis said is extremely important. People feel overwhelmed by the amount of problems that are facing us. And the only way of solving some of the issues is trying to carefully delimiting to whom we will address our help. And in this context, the distinction between migrants and refugees, I will say something about the concept of refugees in a moment, is crucially important. Migrants can be accepted in a country usually based on some form of mutual interest. And many, many countries have indeed benefited from intelligent migration policies. I think the problem of brain drain that Jeff was addressing is an important problem. However, successful migrants often give back to their countries of origin, and one could try to envisage mechanisms to increase their giving back to their countries of origin. I'm not sure that all the brain drain is only a damage for the countries of origin. But refugees are people who do not come and are accepted mainly because it's in a mutual interest, but because they are in dire need. And these are very different moral principles that govern the one and the other. And in order, for example, to accept a high number of refugees, countries must have the right to decline migrants who want to come only for economic reasons, but there is no mutuality there. To refuse to state this right to decline persons who are not refugees means that there will be less resources for refugees. Now, the problem of refugees is indeed that, Jeff, what you are saying, the legal definition of refugees according to the Geneva Geneva Convention limits. It's not simply those who are threatened with regard to their life, but they must be persecuted based on specific criteria, like persecution based on religion or on politics. Persons who are persecuted because there's a civil war in their country going on do not enjoy protection according to the Geneva Convention. They enjoy subsidiary protection, for example, in the European Union, but not based on the Geneva Convention. And I certainly agree that from a moral point of view, there is no big difference whether you are in threat of dying from indiscriminate violence in a civil war like Syria, or because you are the object of persecution targeted at a specific religious or political group. So there is very reasonable ground in trying to develop refugee rights to make it more comprehensive. And again, the European Union has partly done it. But we will only be able to do that if at the same time we recognize that in the case of migrants, mutual interest will be the basic criterion for the policies of states. And the combination of the two, like for example in the Canadian Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, is the most plausible way to sell such laws to the own population. If you do not explain to the population that a lot of the people who come in will benefit the country, they will be not very generous to the refugees. And to have a comprehensive immigration and refugee protection policy is something which would be very reasonable. Germany still doesn't have it. We have no immigration law in Germany. We have been very generous toward refugees compared to other countries, but Germany has not been able to develop an immigration law. And this decreases the willingness of the population to accept persons coming from outside. So in many aspects, the Canadian legal way of combining and distinguish the two things seems to me the best policy.
Thank you. Cardinal Onaiken.
Thank you. I will be talking this evening. I will try not to preempt myself, but simply make a few remarks, 2 remarks on some of the things we've heard today. The first one is that I share President Prodi's difficulty of this distinction, despite the brilliant speech we have just heard from Professor Hursley, distinction between political and economic refugee from point of view of the people concerned. Both are running for their lives, whether it is for political reason, whether it's for specific persecution, or whether it is just to avoid hunger. The moment they are helpless people, they deserve to be helped. And eventually, this will have to be taken seriously. And I hope we will also try and find a positive angle to this whole discussion, that migration in itself can be quite positive. There are a lot of migrants who are doing very well. My country is an example. We have millions of Nigerians in diaspora who have no problem with the countries they are living in. They are doing good business. They are performing well, especially in the United States. And they are bringing millions and millions of dollars back home. The problem we have here are with a small group, and I think they are a small group of people who have difficulties. And my feeling is that if we could only open our hearts, like Professor Lysenges just said, it's not difficult to pay for these things. I think this is a favorite theme of Jeff Sachs. The economic possibilities are there. That is my first. Oh, by the way, I'm surprised when I hear of foreign-born immigrants in America. I thought we are all foreign-born, except the few remnants of American Indians still there. They're all foreign-born. Maybe it depends on how many generations back. I think if they recognize that more and more, the problem might be easier to address. Secondly, I'm glad it was said here that the problem of migrants and refugees, especially as it affects Europe, is mainly two-pronged. The ones from Africa through Libya and North African coast, through the Mediterranean Sea, and the more recent ones from the Middle East because of war. This discussion leaves me alone. I'm the only African here, actually. And I'm just wondering that we still need more people to talk here and bring their experiences. Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example, has a huge problem in this regard. Not to talk of Southern Africa, and then Eastern Africa, Somalia, and all those places. We have a proverb in my place, in our country, that you do not shave somebody's head in his absence, no matter how good a barber you are. Therefore, the fact that the refugees that are giving you headache here are few compared with the ones that are with us at home. The people who are homeless within Africa. Somebody mentioned those running from Burundi to Rwanda, or those even within their own countries, the so-called internally displaced persons. Those stories are not coming out here. They are also human beings who are seeking for a way to live their lives. My suggestion to get us away from pessimism and especially fear of the future is that a new world order should emerge. We have been saying it. And the whole SDG shows that it is possible for the human family to agree to change. It is not an utopia. And I like to look at it that we are now faced with what they call globalization, no matter whatever way you understand. But it simply means we are all together now in the same boat. That, therefore, demands that a new way of looking at things must emerge, and the future cannot be anywhere else but in solidarity, sharing, sense of the fact that we are one human family. If you take that more seriously, then even politicians looking at their electorates should find a way of telling them that there's no future in a situation where you are just looking at yourselves, your country, your nationality, because the world is going beyond that now. The world is going beyond that now. I hope I am not being naive, but I think if I hear Pope Francis speaking, he seems to have that kind of feeling too, that kind of a vision of a world that will not lock itself up in the same old way of looking at things, same old concept of nation, same old concept of international relations. Now, Africa is poor not because we have no resources. We are poor because we are exploited. Change that, and things will change. Thank you.
Cardinal Rodriguez.
I want to thank those who have participated till now. I would like just to make a a reflection. The main two causes of the problem we are examining are economy and war. Okay, both of them could have some solutions. But in the world of economy, what do we see? That every day more and more, some people are just accumulating richnesses. And that's not a solution, because we'll aggravate the situation of thousands, millions that do not have the necessary to survive. So economy has to change that kind of orientation. Equality is the proposal of the social doctrine of the Church. How to achieve more equality and not this kind of unbalances that give the majority of the richness of the world in very few hands. Secondly, war. How come, instead of trying to build peace, some countries are building more bombs, more weapons, more destruction in war? I believe it's necessary, and here comes another problem. I was listening to the General Secretary of the United Nations saying that due to the reduction of funds that some countries are given to the United Nations, it will be necessary to cut the programs of helping, for instance, for refugees or for migrants. I recall the first time I had the opportunity to meet President Romano Prodi. We were a group of cardinals of the Church just trying to talk to the chiefs of the governments in Europe to remind them that the big nations have committed to give 0.7% of the income to development. It was never achieved. Instead, now the governments are committed to give 2% for arms. And this is the pressure, international pressure. So how come can we going to solve or to help to solve this problem when the world is not taking consideration about this? And thirdly, what happens to Laudato Si? I have the opportunity of visiting different countries, especially when I was president of Caritas International. And the encyclical has been ignored in many big countries, not even taken in consideration. And that will be another source of refugees and migrants in the future. The Academy has made a study about water. Well, it's necessary to see now some minerals are going to become strategic in the future, such as lithium. Where are the big reserves of lithium in the world? Guess where? In the southern part of Latin America and in Afghanistan. So we have to consider this, because unless there is a conscience about the preservation of the creation, the problem will continue and will be worse. Thank you.
We have time for one or two more interventions, maybe behind there. Yeah?
I'm from the World Bank. I haven't made to my seat, so just a few remarks. I wanted to make one. I think a lot has been said between need to separate the migrants and refugees, and we just observed how difficult this is becoming for two reasons. Why? One, there is, of course, there are clear refugees, then there are a clear group of the migrants, but then there is a group of very desperate migrants. They don't meet the refugee requirement yet, but they would, for all practical purposes, they can be could be considered refugees. So this definition, the lines are very becoming very blurry to do this, but I agree there were a few comments that needs to be clearer, I guess. And then also, once the migration patterns get established, or refugee patterns rather, then we also have a phenomenon of mixed refugee migration, population using the same patterns, and this becomes very undocumented. So once you have the routes set by the refugees, then you have the migration population also joining the same route. And related to this one, and also related to what Mr. Sachs said about the failed sustainable development, there's one thing maybe that hasn't been mentioned is the role of technology and how it brings the, I think accelerates the pressure on migration going forward, and not even from the low-income countries to higher income, but even, I think, from this larger group of the middle-income countries, as the youth unemployed, but with access to Facebook and Twitters and others, they have this imminent knowledge of what their peers are doing in other countries, and this desire to just have, afford the same level of living and same experiences. And this also only accelerates or puts further pressure, I mean, on the future, the view of the migration. So from this perspective, at the end of the day, it's what the Pope Francis called the right of having dignified life at the home of the people is what would address this issue on the longer term, and through maybe SDGs and so forth, but I think we have other sessions that will get into this. Thank you.
Thank you. Gustavo?
Thank you, Tony. I would like to emphasize one aspect that has to do with economy and war. It's the exponential technological change that our society are facing, the fourth industrial revolution. I will deepen in some of these thoughts in my presentation, but I feel that we have to take into consideration the huge technological change as a possible driver of future and massive displacements of workers within the work and within the same countries. Will be the robots a menace for the future workers? That's not science fiction. This is a reality that we are facing today in our countries, for example, with the phenomenon of relocation of workers, reshoring of workers, but these workers are not being replaced by another workers, but are replaced by robots, by artificial machines, by technology that could pose a very certain menace to the immigration and to the displacement and to the forced displacement of people. The International Federation of Robotics ends up in its last report that for the next year will be in the whole world 35 million of robots sharing our domestic life. The half amount of the total amount of immigrants that the world has right now. So the technological change is an issue very important because it has to do with war and economy. New ways of economy organizing in a way that could menace the equality of our societies, and war is developing extraordinary new change in the technological fields that has an application for both hands, for creating life, for improving life, but also for destroying life in a very precise way as drones are doing that in our current wars.
Thank you, Gustavo. Sheikh Hamza.
Yeah, Bismillah. So two things I want to say about, I really appreciated Dr. Sachs talking about the problem of xenophobia, that there's something historic and natural about the fear of the other. And we've seen this constantly. If you just look in most languages, the names that people use for the other is very interesting. Barbaros in the Greek tradition, the Arabs call the non-Arabs ajam, which literally means those who can't speak. And so this is a major problem, just the fear of the other, xenophobia. And a lot of the religious traditions are actually to break down the fear of the other. So that's, I think, something really important, because in the United States, which has been described as a country of immigrants, there's no people that have come to the United States that have not had difficulty assimilating into the country. The indigenous peoples, over time they assimilate, but when they initially come, they're very often rejected, and there's a lot of duking it out on the street, quite literally. The Irish, one of the major migrations into the United States was during the potato famine, where you had a massive number of Irish immigrants that were looked on as completely unassimilable. They were seen as less than human and attacked. Over time, though, they did completely integrate into the culture and now have some of the most important institutions in terms of learning. The Nigerian community is a very good example of a community that has come to the United States. It's one of the most successful communities in the United States, with a per capita income of about $58,000. Over 20% of the black students now at some of the finest universities are Nigerian, despite the fact they're 0.7% of the black community in the United States. And the question is left, why do so many of the people that come to these countries in the West find it easy to thrive and don't want to tend to go back to their countries because it's difficult for them? And that leads to the problem of institutions, civil society, and failed states in a lot of these countries that are increasing, which is a major problem, just the problem of failed states. So I think that's one aspect. But finally, religious freedom is a major problem that we're dealing with. In the Middle Eastern countries, one of the prides of the Muslim civilization was the protection of these religious communities, like some of the non-traditional Christian communities, like the Nestorian Church, the Chalcedonian Church. These churches thrived. The Coptic Church that was persecuted before the Muslims came into Egypt. Unfortunately, now you're seeing these religious communities in really horrific conditions and wanting to exit these countries that historically they thrived in. So I think religious freedom is an element here that we have to really look in. And finally, the problem of clan, which is the tribalism that exists in many of these places. Europe and America, Europe in particular, transcended a tribal community. Most of the states were tribal states, but in many parts where you're seeing these refugee problems, you're dealing with the problem of clan and this idea of the in-group of the clan and the inability for one group to live with another group. So that's another aspect. Thank you.
We just have a few minutes left, and I would like to circle back to Jeff and maybe Marcelo if we want to respond to some of the things that have been said.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the reflections and for the interventions. I'd like to make 3 points. First, the data show that over the last 3 generations, the total number of displaced people, migrants, the forcefully displaced, has remained quite stable. I think this is a point that Jeffrey alluded to. It takes a massive shock to the ecology of a system for migrants to move up and migrate en masse. This is very, very important. At any given time, 2.5, 2.9% of the global population will be folk living outside the boundaries of the nation state in which they were born. The second point, every year in the beautiful New England fall, I used to teach the young kids at Harvard my course on immigration. And I would start always with the following. Immigrants, we love them, looking backwards. In the here and now, immigration always, always generates near panic. I'm the child of Tuscan and Basque immigrants in Argentina. And in Argentina, we've talked about the United States. We can talk about the other large countries of immigration. And the story repeats itself. The human mind is not limitless in the algorithms it generates qua immigration. Panic nearly always, very fascinating. The Italians and the Eastern Europeans in the United States generated huge pushback. It was said 100 years ago that the Italians, the Irish, the Eastern Europeans couldn't make the transition to the identity, to the narrative of the nation. That they came from cultures and from identities that were incommensurable with the fundamental cultures and identities that made the United States. This is very similar in Argentina and other countries. This was very focused on religion. Catholics were said to be simply not, you couldn't masticate them, you couldn't metabolize them into the Anglo-Saxon tradition. It's very interesting for me to note here in the Holy See that I believe all but one now, all before the new Supreme Justice was appointed, all but one members of the United States Supreme Justice until the most recent appointment were either Catholics or Jews. Now, if a dean at the University of California would have been here 100 years ago to tell you, relax, the Catholics and the Jews in the United States will do very well in due time, this would have been inconceivable, because the reaction was panic, moral panic. They will never adapt. Now, 100 years of data tell a very powerful story. When you look at the main instruments for understanding the transition of both immigrants and refugees, and I think the fetishizing the difference today is not so helpful, because the recombinations are almost like biological in nature, very difficult to capture in essence, a kind of a Bavarian ideal type. Here is the refugee, here is the immigrant in today's world, very difficult. But if you look at the three indices that economists would tend to gravitate towards. If you look, for example, at the transition to the labor market for both immigrants and refugees, if you look, for example, at patterns of the transition and into the acquisition of the new tongue, the new language in the new country, if you look at patterns of segregation, integration, outmarriage, the first rule is this. With immigration, immigration generates a kind of an ethnic flight. This was true of the Jews and of the Italians and of the Eastern Europeans and of all waves of immigrants into the United States. Outmarriage, exogamy. Over time, massive patterns of interconnectivity with other groups. The connection with the labor market is overwhelming. As the Cardinal mentioned, it's today the greatest poverty reduction instrument the world has seen, is the remittances of, we talked about Ghana. Kofi Annan once told me there are more doctors from Ghana in Westchester County, New York, than there are doctors in Ghana. Massive. The gains of the United States are breathtaking. If you think Harvard could run the labs without immigrants, think again. Connectivity with the labor market is overwhelming. The unauthorized population of the United States has less than 5% of the world's population, probably 20% of all the unauthorized, since, according to the most recent data. Massive connectivity with the labor market. They're working. They're working, and this is the love and work that we talked about. And massive pattern of gravitation towards the new language and a concurrent abandonment of the ancestral language. This is a catastrophe from an ethnographic, from an anthropological point of view. You talk to a German American, and in the third generation, they can't say good morning to their grandmother in German. One of my colleagues at Harvard used to say the US is a cemetery for languages. The Italians brought Italian, the Japanese brought Japanese, the Germans brought German. All of these languages died in the US. In regards to the refugee matter, again, the story is a story. Now we have accumulated data, massive patterns of transition. If you look at the waves of the Vietnamese in Europe, if you look at the waves of the Vietnamese in North America, Canada, the United States, Australia, very, very similar story. So let me go into the elephant in the room here, which is the catastrophic collapse in the architectures of rebuilding a home for the children and for the second and third generation of immigrants. It is the failure of integrating, in the broadest anthropological sense of the term, the second and the third generations, not the immigrants themselves, that is driving the most dystopic and the most xenophobic responses to immigration today. We have the case of the Boston Marathon, with two, Manchester yesterday. These are brackets in a pattern of dystopia where it is the children of immigrants, not the immigrants themselves, who gravitate towards very dystopic patterns of long-distance nationalism, alienation, anomie, and in a most monstrous sense, undoing the symbolic journey their parents and their grandparents took in coming to the fine opportunities in the wealthier nations of the world by going back to their countries of origins in very dystopic, in very destructive, in very nihilistic ways. Until we address the crisis of home, we're not going to be able to make the transition of this tiny, again, let me remind you, 9 in 10 refugees will never make it to Berlin, will never make it to Los Angeles, will never make it to Rome. Only one will make it. This is a tiny fraction of the total global need. In the house of the hope of the Pope of Hope, we need to bring hope into the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Jeff, you have the last word of the...
Not the last word, just the last word before the break, because this subject is so endlessly complicated. I just want to reflect on a couple of points. First, what Cardinal Rodriguez said, I think, is extremely important. I would amend it slightly. And his point was, if mass migration is driven by economics and war, then a major part of the answer is equality and peace. In other words, address the underlying causes. And the only amendment, I would say, is economy, war, and environment. So we're going to have 3 fundamental drivers, and we need at least 3 fundamental pillars that go to the root of these. Let me say a word about the war part. I would say war in our time is fundamentally a failure of the UN Security Council. And it's a failure of the UN Security Council because under our international law, the UN Security Council is the place in the world responsible for peace. And I would like us to take that more seriously, to put more responsibility on the Security Council, including the Security Council taking responsibility for the refugees. Because I don't recall a single Security Council session on the Syrian refugee crisis. This was all left to Europe. I don't believe that there was any international responsibility accepted. And This, of course, I'm thinking about my own country, which is the single most irresponsible country in the world right now, the United States, because it creates a lot of the war, but it accepts no responsibility for it. And by putting responsibility more into the UN Security Council, it would also force some responsibility, what economists would call the internalization of externalities, which is to say, you created the Libyan conflict. This was actually a war led by Sarkozy, Cameron, and Obama. It was a war of choice to overthrow Gaddafi. Probably, I think it was 3 individuals that created this war. They bore no particular responsibility for it. And as we've heard, the consequences continue to mount. My own view is that the Syrian war, similarly, this is not a universally held view, but my view is the Syrian war was caused by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey deciding to overthrow Assad. And this was supposed to be a quick, easy operation. 5 years later, it's a mass bloodbath and a regional proxy war. But this is crude geopolitics. And if we don't get to some of this more directly, we will not solve these problems. So I think that we should hold the UN Security Council much more responsible. Last week's visit, highly praised of Mr. Trump to Saudi Arabia, was another danger, big danger, because it was an attempt to create a Sunni front against Iran, extremely dangerous. And the great success, quote unquote, of the meeting was another $100 billion down payment of $350 billion of arms sales. And as President Trump gleefully said, jobs, jobs, jobs. It's revolting, and it's dangerous, and it should be called out, because this is yet the next disaster in the works. So this is the war part, that war is not, the agents of war are not held accountable. They're not invisible forces. In my opinion, Syria is not a civil war. Syria is a regional war stoked by the United States and Saudi Arabia to push Iran influence away. And we don't tell the truth, I think, about these things, and therefore we don't reach solutions on these issues. Then we would face a question which I think we should take up. I won't delay us, but where is the locus of responsibility on the global economy and on the environment? We don't have a Security Council on the economy, and we don't have a Security Council on the environment, but maybe we ought to recommend it. Not that the Security Council is so effective, but at least there's a locus of responsibility which we don't have right now on the other points. Then I want to come to the question about foreign-born, national-born, old concept of nations, new concept of nations. I personally feel very much that we're all immigrants from Africa. We are all one nation. I love the idea. I'm the least nationalistic person among my environment that I know. I'm more on the side that patriotism is the refuge of scoundrels than I am that it's some deeply held view. I don't feel it personally. But I don't think that is a prevailing opinion or a reflection of human nature also. And I also don't think that the graveyard of language idea is very attractive for most of the world. There are a few countries, by dint of geography, history, and genocides of previous populations that are immigrant countries. The United States is one, Canada is another, Australia is a third. These are a combination of large, low population areas that also experience genocides at the hands of the colonists, the colonizers that came. Most of the rest of the world is not like that. So we should understand that the politics are inherently different of multinational countries like the United States and others. If we think about a country like where I was last week, Finland. Finland is not interested in the graveyard of the Finnish language, and they believe that there is a Finnish people. And probably genetically there actually is, and they probably migrated from the Ural region a few thousand years ago, a large part of the ancestry of today's Finnish population. Well, the world is populated by peoples who take their identity, their history, maybe their genetics from migrations of hundreds or thousands of years ago, and their languages. They want to preserve their languages. They want to preserve their cultures. Maybe the world's too complicated for that right now. I don't know. But I don't think it can just be dismissed, because what we're really observing is the strength of that force of identity as provoking our politics and the strongest reactions of it, not the disappearance of these identities. And it comes to another question about the role of religion in this, which we had a wonderful discussion last time, that religion is an invitation to a broad understanding between peoples. I agree with that. But also religion can be used often by power, structures of power, for exactly the opposite reason. Look what's happening in Israel right now, which I really bemoan, that the law is being changed to define Israel as the state of the Jewish people. So, and also to, by proposal not accepted, to delegitimate the Arabic language as an official language, to demote it from an official language. To my mind, this is using Judaism in a horrible way by politicians who are gross and don't reflect the values of Judaism at all. So it's in the name of the religion, but it's really by power, not the religion, at least as I understand the religion. And this is true in many, many places, that religion is hijacked by the power structures, and in its name, the sectarianism is exacerbated, not diminished. So I don't have any answers to any of this, obviously, except to say that I don't think that these are forces that are just ignorable. And Marcelo spoke about, in the US context, the question is the integration of the descendants, but in other contexts, it's the fear of those who are there to what mass immigration would mean. And I think we need to take this seriously. Maybe we want to say that's not legitimate in a world. You can't close up Finnish people. You have no claim to Finland in particular. You happen to be there, but others can come. Good luck. But I don't think that's the way the world is and identity is structured right now. And I think it's a very poignant, difficult, growing problem.
Great. Thank you very much.